The Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello. Our conversation this evening comes from Sarah Harrison, the novelist, Christopher Frayling, Professor of Cultural History at the Royal College of Art, Edward Blishen, the writer, and Laurie Taylor, Professor of Sociology at York University. This time we have music from Sammy Cahn. It's time travel indeed when a television camera edges like a crab into the sunken ballroom of the Titanic, lifting its nerveless eye to the chandelier which hangs from a ceiling alive with fish. We weren't expected here. This was a threshold we had no idea of crossing. What do we think we're there for? As we traverse a dance floor which has long been at the bottom of the sea, or put our heads round the corners of tilting corridors and glass arcades in this submarine 1912 disappeared world. When does curiosity become historical research? Not yet. There are degrees of being dead. When they brought up the Mare Rose, the crew were not only dead, but we felt them to be absent. On the Titanic, the dead seem still to be in possession. You might be able to think of a good reason for going down and having a stare at where they are, but I don't think curiosity is it. The cameras are in, everyone's going to look, but if we did deny ourselves a peep, we could at least be sure we knew the difference between 1,700, I don't have the actual figure, but something of that sort, 1,700 actual deaths and half an hour's peak viewing.
I don't think degrees of being dead may be something to do with it, but I also think it's something about the ways in which people met their death and the significance which can be attached to the ways in which they met their death. Because the point about the Titanic is that these people only died. I mean, there was that they had no say in it. And indeed, its important part in the mythology of the Titanic may be, in fact, that it is unpredictable. As Freud talked about our preference these days for unnatural deaths, because they suggested death depended upon chance rather than necessity. And so, but these people, it is like merely staring at those people who just died. And rather like just staring at a road accident, or just staring, if you like, at people making love, it's too mere. We need to have some reason, some account, some significance to be applied to it before we're allowed to do it. That really raises the other question of why that's the case.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think, you see, that it's not an interest in the dead. I think it's an interest in the living. It's a difference between, for instance, going somewhere like the battlefields of the Somme and looking at all those terrible trenches and tumuli which indicate man's inhumanity to man, and as it were paying your respects to the dead. There's an element of prurient curiosity in it, but this is a times capsule. This is about how people lived, not how people died. What we do when we look at those extraordinary magical photographs is picture what people were doing. We don't think about the dead at all, and I think that's the difference, and that's what makes it much more fascinating.
But aren't all tombs and tombstones flags flying over the lives of people? They aren't, of course, celebrating their death. They're merely saying that the person who is dead has signalled that a life has actually been led, and we must acknowledge it in some way. I suspect not by staring at it, because you're absolutely right in my view, it is about aliveness, but by, well, baring the head, just take your hat off as you walk past, or just fail to have that peep. That will acknowledge that these people were once, as you rightly say, alive. And if we don't do it, I suspect a tiny bit of savour is going to go out of the lives we are currently living. But there, Christopher.
But I think, I mean, one of the points about the Titanic in particular is that it's taken on a life of its own almost as an image, just as the Mary Rose did. I mean, when the Mary Rose came up in Falklands, Britain, it was like our maritime power being dredged up from the bottom of the sea, and it became a great symbol. Equally, the Titanic's been used as a symbol in all sorts of ways. There was even a Nazi film made, I don't know if you know, in the early 40s, which was all about nasty financiers driving German sailors to their death by racing against an iceberg. So it has it's what the French insist on calling a mythology. It has a life and rules all of its own. So it isn't a case, I think, of just staring at dead people, as it were. It's a case of reading into the picture all sorts of things that we know about the Titanic. I mean, for example, when those photos came up about a year ago, where it said NB, look at Edwardian hat, in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture. Now, I couldn't see an Edwardian hat, but I wanted to see an Edwardian hat. All I could see was a little bit of bollard that had been intensified about 50 times. So it's not a shipwreck, it's a piece of culture almost.
Yeah, the only thing is, Christopher, what you're saying may seem to be true, but we know what the facts are. It isn't a mythology, it's a real place, it's a real ship, and they did do it.
It's both at once, isn't it?
Yeah,
right.
But it is an event that was seized upon. I remember in the 20s seeing a film called Buttons at the local cinema, and it was remotely and closely based on the Titanic. I remember it was quite remote in the sense that there was the perfect ship, and there was the perfect iceberg, and there was also the cruel first mate who imprisoned a member of the crew in the lockup, and who redeemed his whole hideous existence by saving him as the ship went down. There was also, I remember, a captain, must have been the youngest captain of a liner ever, about 24 years old, I should think, who had he'd been rejected by a lady passenger. And I remember that as the iceberg was struck, she rushed to the bridge and attempted to speak to him. And he said, "Never speak to the man at the helm." I was about 8 at the time, and I longed to find an opportunity to say this to a little tormenting girl I knew called Joan Rankin. I longed to find a moment when I could say, "Never speak to the man at the helm." But it was all based on the Titanic. You see, that was, I suppose, 16 years after the Titanic. It was still, but as Christopher says, it was already something that people were basing stories on.
But isn't it curious? Isn't it, just to pursue that point, is it not curious? You're describing what sounds like a not very good film. And we can do all sorts of recreations of this event.
Yes.
And if you wanted to theorise, if you were sitting on Mars theorising about life down here, you'd think to yourself, well, that must surely be a greater desecration than simply poking about in the ruins. But, curiously, it isn't.
But that's why the desecration is allowed, because the Titanic does stand for so many things. We've already begun to bring out many of the things. It's like too good a story, it's too good an account, it's too good a myth to be done away with because we are a little bit concerned about the bodies. I mean, it isn't just... It was recognised immediately what it stood for, or its potency, if you like. I mean, the Sunday after the disaster, the Bishop of Winchester referred to the Titanic. Yes,
good,
but here's an interesting thing.
Like
Just one Sunday, he said that the Titanic, name and thing, will stand for a monument and warning to human presumption. That's just like a few days after the thing. Now, to say that and to realise that, as Sarah was saying about the fact it's a class thing, I mean, you're like talking about what these people were doing at the time, because this is also a boat which is carrying mostly first-class people. It is full of nannies and governesses and maids and all these people, yet it doesn't have enough lifeboats. It's like a moral in that sense. Here's the ruling class goes to sea, but it doesn't carry its lifeboats with it. It's like the revolutionary metaphor. And then the other thing is just that sheer fact that it wasn't unpredictable. But we have to believe it was unpredictable because we love the unpredictable story.
Actually, the first-class passengers did have lifeboats. It was the steerage passengers.
Yes, they were saved.
Which is a slightly different thing. But I've also been doing some research, and there's a marvellous line which, for me, summarises the English version of the myth of the Titanic, which is a porter going up the gangplank with a first-class passenger carrying her baggage, saying, "Oh, madam, God himself could not sink this ship." And that extraordinary sort of damaging of certainty that occurred with the Titanic, which most of the films, most of the books about the Titanic symbolise in some way, nothing will ever quite seem certain again, is very important. And to see the actual empirical proof of it in front of you in photographs is really quite something.
Don't you think it's much more potent in imagination, as it has been until now, and indeed, as far as I'm concerned, still is, because I've yet to see any such pictures? Wouldn't you say it was stronger?
I don't know. You see, it's a matter of where one draws
You might reduce it to an anecdote if you had an actual look at it.
It's possible, although do you think, I mean, by digging up the bog people, for example, that the bog people aren't... they're terribly romantic, all sorts of associations. We're all related to the bog people, probably. Do we feel bad about, as relatives of the bog people, do we feel bad about them being dug out?
It's a great point. I'll return to that one, but Sarah, you wanted to say something.
But once and if it has been raised, if it's ever happens, the secrecy will obviously finish. One of the most piquant things about it, it's like one of those cameras they put down the human gullet and sort of film the larger intestine, you know, because it's where no man can go.
Right.
And while it remains down there and that little camera pries on our behalf in what, after all, is a much larger world than ours, and one of the most sort of titillating, I hate to use the word, but it's true, things about it is the idea that sharks will float across that ballroom and octopuses will lurk in those staterooms.
This is the high-class anecdote, the highly coloured anecdote,
but
isn't it?
But it's all good stuff,
but it's
don't you
terrible.
think that's
No, you have an enormous disproportion between the curiosity which you are illustrating and the event, which is much larger.
But I wonder,
sure.
I wonder what would be said about this by Joseph Conrad, who wrote, after the Titanic inquiry, wrote a brilliant piece of ironical journalism about the whole affair, which is also an immensely sad account of what he thought to be a stupid catastrophe. That's what he called it. And he said it would be amusing, if it could be amusing, because of the crestfallen attitudes of the technicians who'd made the perfect boat. And he pointed out that in a way a schoolboy would perfectly understand, to divide a boat into watertight compartments, you had to divide it completely. And he pointed out that the Titanic was only partly divided. He said she was just sufficiently divided to drown some poor devils like rats in a trap. And he said the false, written-up Drury Lane aspects of the event, that's how he described the current response, I mean the sentimental response, the sentimental rewriting of the event at the time. And there's nothing, he said, more heroic in being drowned very much against your will in a hold, helpless, big tank in which you bought your passage than in dying of colic caused by the imperfect salmon in the tin you bought from your grocer. And, of course, everybody shouted him down at the time because this was thought to be an infamous and irreverent comment on a great and almost religious event, the sinking of the ship.
It'll be interesting to see, though, whether or not the prying around that you are describing, what it does to the myth, how much it destroys or how much that myth is replaced with another one, because, I mean, another version can come around. There is an element in which you don't want it to be played around with. I'm not so much thinking of the dead bodies as rather like when Thomas sticking his, fingers into Christ's wounds, that terrible moment of saying, I'm going to empirically check up on this account of the resurrection, I don't believe it, and that you suddenly think no one has the right to be as empirical about a mystery as that. The Titanic is is this mythological thing, and you can't go around with a camera and resolve it.
But it's a matter of whether the mystery has a big M or a little m, because actually the little m mystery of the Titanic, there's lots of things that the researchers can find out, as far as I can see. Nobody quite knows what caused it. The American inquiry blamed all sorts of people. The British inquiry was a whitewash. We don't even know whether the band was playing Nearer My God to Thee or Autumn as the ship went down. There's a great scholarly dispute about this amongst the members of the Titanic Historical Society. Maybe all sorts of things to find out.
But that's not the impulse, is it?
No, although I think a part of the impulse is the sheer technology which makes this possible. I think at a research level, I mean, it is quite extraordinary to go 2 miles down and take photos that are recognisable. And
it sounds like a plea in mitigation.
Well, maybe. I mean, as Laurie perhaps knows to his cost, maybe it's you have to do a bit of gimmickry in order to fund research. I mean, maybe this is what this is all about.
It could be, but you see, Laurie spoke of the street accident, and it's a little like hurrying to it because you're not going to do anything except stare, perhaps, when you get there. But here you have an actual preserved tableau. It's actually all there, or we imagine it is all there. We hear about the ballrooms and the corridors and the companionways and so on. It's as though it only happened the moment before. And what we're doing, going up to 1912, I don't really know if I've got the year correct, but it's sometime like that, 1912, let us say, and it's a street accident, and it only happened a moment before. Right. And that, somehow, I've tried to tease out a sufficient reason for why I think really we shouldn't be peeping. You can't stop it. But I would have thought that maybe is it.
But isn't it like mummification? Isn't it like King Tut being put under, preserved exactly at the moment as a funeral, and Howard Carter opens things up, and there it is. It's like a time capsule.
Which brings us to Tolland Man and the Peat Bog people and all of that. I heard someone say, don't you think it's rather a desecration to put him on view in a museum? I do not. I think time comes into it, but I think it's an honourable estate to be buried in a museum where people can come along, not to slake their curiosity, I suspect, but as an act of piety, to dwell, to consider their ancestors and the tradition of which they too are part.
But, Bob, I think you're being what I always think that I'm going to be, and am usually. That's priggish, actually, really, about the whole thing.
Oh, I knew someone was going to lower the tone.
No, I'm not. I hope I'm not lowering the tone at all. In fact, I believe that the curiosity we feel about this is very much related to the notion that the whole of life is I mean, it's a series of terrible accidents. History is a series of terrible accidents. We look back on history as a series of terrible accidents. We are as dignified as we can be about our vulgarity. Our vulgarity is real and inescapable. We are vulgarly interested in these things, but we must be as dignified about it as we can. But I don't believe we have much of a choice between the two. We must agree to be dignified and vulgar together.
It's the best point I've heard so far, that, Edward. I wholly agree. I wholly agree with you.
But I think we're far too worried in whether we are being vulgar and whether we should be ashamed of our prying curiosity. I mean, who the heck cares about us? What we should be worrying about is whether it's going to offend anybody else, isn't it? The people who knew or were related to the people who went down. Now, it seems to me that if I was someone who had a loved one or a close friend who had gone down on the Titanic, I would be pleased, after all the endless media hype, the ghastly films with star cameos and all the rest of it, and the supposition and the hypothesis, to actually, as it were, have the grave marked, like the war widows who felt they had to go back to the Far East and finally see the place where their husband fell or where he was buried. I would be pleased at that, and I would feel that that was a sort of a cleansing and a right thing to happen.
Yes, it's not just us, of course, that have moral qualms about this. It comes in the strangest places. Last year, the ITCA actually banned a television advertisement for a certain brand of mild cigar, which was going to use the idea of the raising of the Titanic. In fact, they made the ad. The idea was the Titanic would be raised. As it reached the surface, the captain of the rescue ship would look at it, and a new iceberg would come into frame. And as it reached the surface, it went down.
I was going to say I don't believe it, but I thoroughly believe it.
It absolutely happened, and the ITCA, not normally moral guardians, felt that this was very, very insulting to the relatives of the victims. Now, I'm not sure they weren't being a bit priggish. Yes. I think that sort of image is in the public domain.
There is a possibility that if you do have these pictures, and if they are only there for curiosity, they might do what Edward suggests. They might also go further. They might also become a kind of mausoleum, as you have at Leningrad, where it's paved over, solemn music, or even, I have to say, solemn muzak is played. It doesn't stop the tear starting to the eyes, speaking of my own eyes, but it's abstracted from the events because it's paved over. It seems a possibility that the television pictures will start as a raree show and end up as a mausoleum, a proper sort of mausoleum.
Well, the abstracted is the key point, in my opinion. I'm not sure that people looking at those pictures think about death at all. No. I think they think about lots of other things, you know, Edwardian life, the end of that stratification, steerage passengers were allowed boats after that sort of thing. The whole kind of lumbering mechanism of popular culture that surrounded the Titanic, those are the things that go through one's head, because the image looks very like the images we've seen in the cinema, on television, and reproduced from reproduction newspapers and so on. So I think it's very abstracted from the notion of death, except perhaps for those relatives who can actually recognise people.
What we're going to have now is some music, and it's called Style, and it's both written and sung by Sammy Cahn.
You've either got or you haven't got style. If you've got it, it stands out a mile. A flower's not a flower when it's wilted, and a hat's not a hat till it's tilted. You've either got or you haven't got class. How it draws the applause of the masses when you wear lapels like the swellest of swells. You can pass any mirror and smile. You've either got or you haven't got or you haven't got or you haven't got style. You've either got or you haven't got style. If you have it, it stands out a mile. With mother of pearl kind of buttons, you'll look like the Astors and the Huttons. You've either got or you haven't got charm. Style and charm sorta go arm in arm. When you wear those duds with those white tie and studs. Watch those dolls lining up single file. You've either got or you haven't got. Got or you haven't got. Got or you haven't got style.
That was Sammy Cahn singing about style, and it was high-class stuff, quality, but of course we are turning aside. We stand what he's just sung adjacent to what we now say. I don't know whether the rest of you know what a style book is. Well, you do now because you've been looking at one, but I mean, other people may not. It's a newspaper term, and it describes the various conventions of presentation that over the years the paper's developed so that its writers and its subs know what the house style is. It's a catalogue of usage. It tells the journalists how the paper wants them to say things. And the better the paper, the more interesting the style book. But why I'm so enthusiastic about the Economist style book, which goes public this week, and I'm not sure that that phrase, going public, isn't a barbarism. I could have said is published, but then the Economist style book says never use the passive when you can use the active. Anyway, I'm keen on it because the accidental and the haphazard, having become so general in newspapers with misprints and omissions and transpositions, so much the general climate now that they seem like a new way of writing where the reader has to guess at the meaning. The idea that there still can be a style book, that it's still possible to have a unified view of the way the printed word works, well, I found it enormously encouraging.
I did too, Bob. I'm a little worried about that word style. You've explained perfectly that it has a special meaning in newspaper offices. I'm a little worried about people who might pick it up supposing it's a complete guide to how to write well, because it seems to be some things it can't cover. Obviously it can't cover the way in which you make quite sure that a sentence is all right for the sentences around it, all that sort of thing, that complication. But otherwise, I think it's beautiful, and it says something so pleasantly. The problem with problem is that it's overused, so much so that it's becoming a problem word. I mean, there are nice formulations, aren't there? I mean,
it's a humane sort of voice, at least I would say so. I mean, as they say engagingly in the preface, yes, the rules are entirely arbitrary, yes, but they're their rules and they use them, and you might not actually agree with the way they get on with the semicolon and the colon, but you don't mind the voice. You think it's not a bad way of looking at the English language and communication, well, even if you disagree.
Is that so? Because for me, you had to be a sort of card-carrying political economist at times to understand some of the rules that they were laying down. For example, unless an abbreviation is so familiar that it is used more often than the full form, e.g. GATT, G-A-T-T, sometimes called the GATT. Now, does anybody around the table know what GATT is?
I nearly know. I nearly know.
Well, they don't tell
it's
us.
something to do with economics.
We obviously have to read The Economist.
No, but you see that trait there. You don't buy The Economist. I mean, perhaps you're not intelligent enough any more than I am, but I mean, they're catering for their own customers.
Absolutely, but they are saying that, one should pitch it simple, one should avoid jargon, one should not patronise the reader. And here's GATT, and it isn't GAP, G-A-A-P, because we discover that it's generally accepted accounting principles a couple of pages later. I thought the other thing that slightly alarmed me was its remark on jargon, where it says, all sections of The Economist should be intelligible to all our readers, most of whom are foreigners.
Yeah.
Now, in my experience...
A jolly good point.
Well, except that in my experience, the French and Germans adore jargon. I'd feel terribly upset if they don't get any jargon.
Yeah, but they wouldn't get their own jargon. They get ours.
That's
you wouldn't tip the contents of your dustbin into the next door garden or their dustbin, would you?
I don't think that I agree with the statement that you made. The better the paper, I think you said, the better the style book.
More
because
interesting,
I think the best style book of this sort that I've come across was Keith Waterhouse's book on the Daily Mirror style, which is a splendid book because he's saying that in the 1930s that popular journalism did a great deal. It was like it had a vigorous language, it had an exciting way with words, and it did something to break up the stodgy, ponderous, rather pompous language of the
What makes you think
newspaper.
I didn't think that the Daily Mirror in the 1930s, 40s, and just for a moment in the 1950s wasn't a good paper?
No, but Waterhouse wrote this book.
Now,
Waterhouse wrote this book recently. I mean, I can't remember when it was written, but it's about, say, 10 years ago, something like that, when he wrote it. But yes, okay, well, I'll take the point that if you were talking about it then, but in this book he attempts to recover something of that idea of popular journalism. I mean, he attempts to say, why can't it be vigorous? And he has many more examples taken from, I mean, like the use of the blob, you know, that great big thing that they put on the left-hand side when you're saying, Mrs. Thatcher must pay more attention to South Africa, Mrs. Thatcher must pay more attention, and when the blob on the left-hand side is used, you know, and how short the sentence can be. So it's rather fascinating.
To explain this, I really didn't follow. Yes. What is the blob?
Well, you know, when you imagine a mirror editorial, you know, that sort of
very
like short
easily.
Editorial, and then you will have that very sort of like large black circle on the left. And points come down. A list comes down the right-hand side. Waterhouse says you can only have 3, and blobs may only be used, in fact, when they start with the same words, like Mrs. Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher. So these are the rules. Now, the rules of popular journalism suddenly become very interesting.
In the hands of Keith Waterhouse, they
yes,
do.
Yes,
but
yeah,
not necessarily in anyone else's.
Bob, I think the weakness of it, if I dare say so, is really that, for example, in statements like use full stops because this enables you to write short sentences. Use as many full stops as possible because this enables you to use short sentences which help the reader. Now, I've just read a book which is almost entirely composed of short sentences, and it's really like being shot at by a pea shooter. Every sentence is a pea, and it hurts, it stings, and after time you become inattentive because you're numbed by the similarity of the sentences. And I think here that they do offer, perhaps to unsuspecting readers, a piece of misleading advice. I would like them to say, yes, short sentences are jolly good, but also varied with longer sentences, and try to make your longer sentences clear.
Well, but they do put at the beginning that little list of things that George Orwell said you should and you shouldn't do, which ends up, as you recall, with Orwell saying, but breach any of these rules if you're in danger of committing a first-rate outright barbarism.
Yes, exactly, because, I mean, the whole thing about a book of high style is it is essentially a wiping clean of the stylistic slate in order that proper style may sort of develop on top of it. Because, I mean, as Edward said at the beginning, I mean, style is something which develops over a period. We're talking very specifically about press style here, which is anti-style. You get rid of it all first. You learn those basic rules. But style, I mean, to develop onto proper style is something which develops gradually layer upon layer when you learn how to break the rules, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I did think they were terribly nitpicking. I mean, for instance, something they suggest about hyphenation. They say you mustn't say an ex-liberal member. They say he has lost his party, but you must say a Liberal ex-member has lost his seat or something. There's some difference here, but I thought, well, the difference is of the force that you give the word member, which is terribly worrying.
Potted biographies. You're into the area of potted biographies, and I don't know. I don't know why they're so severe about that. Because I mean, I should just be quoting Waterhouse against it. But I mean, when he says love, tangle, vicar, and devoted family man, as it were, the preceding biography, and he said the interesting thing was when he goes back and you look at all those, that the readers began to write in and say, dear old codgers, could I have a word about former Manchester United problem player George Best? But he says, used carefully, it doesn't matter. What you were saying, though, reminded me of something that Bernice Rubin said about grammar to a writer being a total irrelevance, but they must at one time have loved it. And only having loved it, then it becomes the irrelevance.
Yes, because only part of this book is concerned with all these things. Most of it is sort of lists of Commonwealth countries and things, frightfully useful for ticking them off as they leave the games and so on. And, esoteric knowledge about Russia and China and so on. And this is what I mean about a manual for political economists. It's a strange fusion of two kinds of knowledge, I think. I mean, knowledge of current affairs and stylistic. And I think there's some questionable judgments in it.
I remember when I taught at university, but being appalled by the number of young people who've been allowed to develop a view of the sentence as a kind of sloppy washing bag in which they thrust every dirty bit of their meaning. I mean, as it came. And in order to understand what they meant, you had to turn every sentence out on the floor and then sort it out and try to find out whether they were being brilliant or just daft.
Well, this book stands against that, but I think admirably, and it harks back to a time when the climate was not what it now is in newspapers. Newspapers looked clearer, they just actually looked clearer, and I think were probably the communication part of it, from which you cannot divorce the way it looks, was clearer. Now, the climate's changed, and in my opinion, it's changed because the technology is like a sort of layer of Scotch mist. You can still see through it, but I think it's tainting or generalising the product. Sometimes there are so many misprints. Actually, the misprint now being the climate, you have to coin a new word. I mean, you have to learn to read misprints, but you sometimes look at it and you feel there's so many negatives may have been dropped out between the keyboard and the computer and the actual printing process that you sometimes wonder. You alter your perspective of what the man's trying to tell you all the time. You sometimes wonder, is he saying yes or is he saying no?
It also puts the clock back to before feminism. Don't use chairperson in the chair for a woman. Use sex, not gender, of people. Now, I'm missing the point of why people get squeamish about using the word sex. And the trade names listed for uppercase use are Hoover and Valium. Now, I think there's something very strange going on in this book.
It's also very
just pursue that a bit.
Snooty about Ms. as well.
I mean, yes, and Ms. and Mrs. It seems to be suggesting that all that sort of politics of language that surrounded feminism from the late 60s onwards should be swept, and we should get back to the good old 1950s Mr., Mrs. and Master. I think that's a bit worrying.
Well, if it were so, I would agree with you. I'm not too sure.
But there seems to be a consistency in their treatment.
It does say a peculiar thing about that Ms., which you think about it, which isn't in line with anything else it says. It says that you should use the word Miss unless the person has made it clear that they don't want it to be used. Yes. As in, it says Miss Jane Fonda, which is really rather odd, because presumably of all the people who might have wished that it would have been altered, Jane Fonda would have been among the leaders of that. But I just wanted to ask you a question, because I remember you talking, Bob, once about Roger and saying that talking about that a good writer would never use it and never refer to it. And I wonder...
Not a capable writer.
Yes, all right. But I wondered about whether or not anyone, at any point where they reach a moment when they are writing, says, I will now open this book and check the point. I mean, it is fun to read because you're not writing, almost. That's what makes it fun, because you think, aha, I sort of know that, and yes, my word, and isn't it good that other people are stating it? And
yeah, I think you've got a point there.
I must say about...
Sarah, who is a novelist... Which is not to say that you are not, Edward, but I think it's about her...
Laurie pointed at me, I forgot it wasn't you.
Please.
No, of sorts. I was just thinking about your feeling that it's good that this thing exists, that somehow it's getting back to the old values. But it's sort of nannyish and wrist-slapping tone. It gets a bit irritating about cliches, because it seems to me that it ignores the fact... It lists, for instance, at one point, a whole number of cliches which appeared in The Economist under one poor, wretched person's authorship, in the space of one page, and every one gets sort of a minus number of brownie points for having been used. But the whole point about a cliche is that if it's, as it were, cast against the role, if it's used in the right place and out of context, it can be extremely telling that you can use as much jargon as you like and as much cliches as you like if they're in the wrong place, because then they're fresh.
The whole of the works of S.J. Perelman stand there to prove your point.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, I must say, what I was going to say, as far as I can remember it, there must here be a tragic pause while I try to...
You're playing with a sympathy mode. Get off.
I take up Laurie's point. I shall add this to the number of books I have beside me as I write, which I never look at, including Hart's Rules to the Printers and so on, and Fowler and so on. And I feel that their mere presence makes me a safe, a secure, a satisfactory writer. But Roger, I actually do use, Bob, but that's obviously a discussion you've already had.
We have. We won't go through it again tonight.
What I don't think, again, you see...
We're trying to earn our money.
What again, I don't think it actually covers are those wonderful tragedies that occur with people who are trying to achieve style. A friend of mine, a really very distinguished educationist, writing a review, beginning a review with his usual exquisite care, began, nobody will get nothing from this book. And the proof arrived, and it obviously had passed through the hands of a sub-editor who was able to accommodate a desolate view of the illiteracy of distinguished educationists, because she had corrected it. Nobody will get anything from this book.
Sarah Harrison, Professor Christopher Frayling, Edward Blishen and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Sammy Cahn provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.